The first time Brandon realized something was wrong with Rocky was the night the dog dragged Chloe's engagement ring box under the kitchen stove and refused to let anyone touch it. Chloe had laughed nervously at first, kneeling on the hardwood floor of Brandon's apartment in downtown Denver while candlelight flickered across the walls and soft jazz played from a speaker near the window. "Your dog seriously hates me," she joked, but the smile on her face didn't quite reach her eyes. Rocky stood frozen between them, his ears pinned back, staring directly at Chloe with a low rumble vibrating deep in his chest. Brandon had owned the German Shepherd for almost 6 years and had never once seen him act like that around anyone. Rocky wasn't aggressive. He was the kind of dog neighbors trusted around their kids, the kind that patiently waited outside coffee shops without barking or pulling at the leash. But ever since Chloe moved into Brandon's apartment 3 months earlier, something had changed. Little things at first. Rocky blocking hallways whenever Chloe walked past, refusing treats from her hand, sitting outside Brandon's office door every single night. Then came the staring. Long, silent staring that made Chloe visibly uncomfortable. Brandon kept telling himself the dog simply needed time to adjust. Yet tonight felt different. Wrong somehow. The apartment smelled faintly of vanilla candles and rain drifting in from the balcony door, but underneath it all Rocky seemed alert, tense, almost frightened. Brandon crouched near the stove and reached for the small velvet ring box wedged against the wall. The second his fingers touched it, Rocky barked so violently that Brandon nearly hit his head on the counter. Chloe jumped backward with a scream, knocking over a wine glass that shattered across the tile floor. "That's it," she snapped, breathing hard. "I'm done pretending this is normal." Rocky immediately stepped between Brandon and Chloe again, his body rigid, eyes locked on her purse sitting near the dining table. Brandon grabbed the dog's collar, shocked by the intensity in him. Rocky stopped, but the dog wouldn't even look at Brandon. He kept staring at Chloe's bag like something inside it terrified him. Chloe folded her arms tightly. "You see this now, right? He's obsessed with me." Brandon opened his mouth to apologize, but something stopped him. Rocky was shaking, not with anger, fear. The dog suddenly lunged past Brandon, sprinted toward the dining table, and slammed his entire body against Chloe's purse hard enough to knock it onto the floor. Makeup scattered everywhere. A lipstick rolled under the couch. Chloe's face instantly went pale. "Don't touch that," she blurted out far too quickly. The room fell silent except for Rocky's growling. Brandon stared at Chloe in confusion while the dog backed away from the purse, whining softly now, almost desperately. Then Brandon noticed something sticking halfway out of the open zipper. It wasn't makeup. It wasn't a wallet either. It was a second cell phone, and the screen was lighting up with a message that read, "He has no idea about us." Brandon slowly picked up the second phone while Chloe stood motionless beside the dining table, her face drained of color. Rocky stayed low near the kitchen entrance, watching every movement with uneasy eyes that no longer looked angry but exhausted. The message on the screen disappeared before Brandon could fully process it, replaced by a lock screen photo of a smiling couple he did not recognize. "It is not what you think," Chloe said quickly, stepping forward to grab the phone. But Rocky immediately let out another warning growl that froze her in place. Brandon had never heard that sound from him before. It was not loud or violent. It sounded protective, desperate even. Brandon stared at the unfamiliar phone in his hand while memories slowly began surfacing in ways he could no longer ignore. Over the past few months, Rocky had changed so much that Brandon barely recognized him anymore. Before Chloe moved in, the German Shepherd used to wait by the apartment door every evening around 6 o'clock sharp, tail wagging wildly the second Brandon stepped off the elevator. They had routines. Friday night burger runs. Long walks through Washington Park before sunrise. Rocky sleeping beside Brandon's bed during thunderstorms because loud noises still scared him after his years in the shelter. Brandon had adopted Rocky during the loneliest year of his life after losing his father unexpectedly. Back then the apartment felt empty and painfully quiet. Rocky had changed that. The dog filled the silence without needing words. But ever since Chloe arrived, Rocky had slowly become withdrawn. He stopped bringing Brandon his tennis ball in the mornings. He stopped eating immediately when food hit the bowl. Some nights Brandon would wake up around 2 in the morning and find Rocky sitting alone in the dark living room staring toward the hallway where Chloe slept. Not barking, not moving, just watching. Brandon had asked a veterinarian about it 2 weeks earlier, worried something might be medically wrong. The vet told him Rocky appeared healthy physically but stressed emotionally. Dogs do not fake discomfort. The older woman had explained gently while Rocky leaned against Brandon's leg. When they stop feeling safe, they change. Brandon remembered feeling guilty after hearing those words. Chloe had insisted the dog was jealous because she and Brandon were getting serious. She constantly joked that Rocky acted like an ex-girlfriend trapped in a dog's body. Brandon laughed along at first because it felt easier than admitting how uncomfortable the situation actually was becoming. He wanted peace between them so badly that he ignored things he normally would not. Like how Rocky always flinched whenever Chloe entered a room unexpectedly. Or how the dog refused to stay inside the apartment alone with her. 3 different times Brandon had returned home from work to find Rocky sitting outside the building near the parking garage, trembling beside the security gate even though Chloe swore she had left him upstairs. Each time she blamed faulty latches or said the dog was being dramatic. Brandon wanted to believe her. But now, standing there with the hidden phone in his hand, he suddenly remembered something else. Earlier that week, he had come home unexpectedly during lunch and found Rocky lying directly in front of Brandon's office door. The dog had looked terrified. Inside the office, desk drawers were slightly open. Chloe claimed she had been searching for printer paper. Brandon believed her at the time. Now his stomach tightened. Across the apartment, Rocky slowly backed farther into the shadows near the hallway, lowering his head as if expecting Brandon to be angry with him again. Then Brandon noticed something that made his chest sink. The dog's stainless steel water bowl near the laundry room was completely full, untouched for what looked like hours, and beside it sat an unopened container of Rocky's medication that Brandon could have sworn he had asked Chloe to give him that morning. The next morning Brandon barely slept. The second phone remained locked inside his desk drawer while Chloe acted strangely calm, almost too calm, moving around the apartment making coffee and humming softly like the night before had never happened. Rocky, however, looked worse than ever. The German Shepherd refused to come near the kitchen while Chloe was inside it. Instead, he paced in slow circles around the living room, nails clicking sharply against the hardwood floor every few seconds in a rhythm that slowly began getting under Brandon's skin. At first, Brandon thought the dog simply needed rest, but the behavior kept escalating in ways he could not explain. Around 9 that morning, Chloe grabbed her purse and announced she was heading downstairs to pick up a package from the lobby. The moment the apartment door shut, Rocky sprinted toward the hallway closet so suddenly that Brandon spilled coffee across his shirt. The dog jammed his snout against the bottom drawer and clawed at it frantically. Brandon pulled the drawer open, expecting maybe a toy or hidden treat, but Rocky ignored everything inside except a small gray hoodie Brandon had not worn in months. The dog grabbed it gently in his mouth and dragged it toward the front door, whining under his breath the entire time. "What are you doing?" Brandon muttered in confusion. Rocky dropped the hoodie directly in front of the apartment entrance and sat beside it, staring at Brandon with desperate eyes. Then, just as suddenly, he bolted toward the balcony window and started barking at the parking lot 6 stories below. Brandon stepped outside expecting to see another dog or loud truck. Instead, he saw Chloe near the curb talking to a man in a black baseball cap beside a silver SUV. The second she noticed Brandon looking down from the balcony, she abruptly walked away from the man and disappeared back inside the building. When Chloe returned upstairs minutes later, Rocky reacted instantly. Not aggressively. Worse, he grabbed Brandon's wrist with his mouth and physically tried pulling him toward the office like he was attempting to show him something. Brandon jerked his hand away in shock. Rocky enough. The dog froze immediately, backing away with his tail low, but his breathing remained fast and uneven. Chloe crossed her arms. "This is getting creepy now," she whispered. "He is acting like he owns you." Brandon tried brushing it off, yet the apartment no longer felt normal. Even the air seemed tense. Throughout the afternoon, Rocky refused to settle down. Every single time Chloe touched her purse, opened a drawer, or walked near Brandon's office, the dog reacted. Once he knocked over an entire floor lamp, trying to block Chloe from entering the bedroom closet. Another time, Brandon heard scratching behind the bathroom door and found Rocky sitting inside the dark room surrounded by scattered towels because Chloe had apparently locked him in there for nearly 20 minutes without mentioning it. "I forgot he was in there," she said flatly, though Rocky immediately pressed himself against Brandon's leg, trembling the second the door opened. By evening, Brandon's nerves were completely shot. Chloe finally snapped during dinner after Rocky suddenly climbed beneath the table and shoved his body between her chair and Brandon's. "You need to do something about this dog," she said coldly. "This is not normal behavior anymore." Brandon looked down at Rocky, expecting the dog to move away. Instead, the German shepherd slowly lifted one paw onto Brandon's knee and dropped something small into his lap. It was a gold key Brandon had never seen before, attached to a motel keychain from a place nearly 40 miles outside Denver. Brandon turned the motel key over in his hand while silence settled heavily. Across the apartment, the cheap plastic tag hanging from the ring read Pine Ridge Lodge Room 214 in faded red letters. Chloe stared at it for half a second before forcing out an awkward laugh. "Seriously," she said. "Now your dog is stealing random junk too?" Brandon looked down at Rocky, hoping the dog would finally calm down and make this all feel less unsettling. Instead, Rocky sat perfectly still beside Brandon's chair, eyes fixed entirely on Chloe again. The dog looked exhausted, almost worn down from trying so hard to communicate something nobody understood. Chloe suddenly pushed her plate away and stood up. "I cannot do this anymore, Brandon." Her voice cracked just enough to sound believable. "I moved in because I love you, but your dog watches me like I am some kind of criminal every single day." Brandon rubbed his forehead, emotionally drained after weeks of tension and now the bizarre discovery of the hidden phone and motel key. He wanted explanations, but more than anything he wanted peace. Chloe stepped closer, lowering her voice softly. "I know you love him. I get that. But this is not healthy anymore." Rocky immediately stood up and moved between them again. Not growling this time, just blocking. Chloe's eyes filled with tears. "See," she whispered. "He will not even let me stand next to you." Brandon felt trapped. Every time Chloe tried opening up emotionally, Rocky reacted. Every time Rocky reacted, Chloe looked hurt. It was becoming impossible to tell where instinct ended and paranoia began. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Brandon started hiding the motel key and second phone in his office desk, unsure what to think yet unable to stop thinking about them. Chloe acted increasingly fragile around Rocky, flinching whenever the dog entered a room. Once she claimed Rocky snapped at her while Brandon was showering. Another night, she woke Brandon at 3 in the morning saying Rocky had been sitting outside the bedroom door, making strange sounds for over an hour. Brandon walked into the hallway and found Rocky lying there silently with his chin resting on the floor, eyes half closed from exhaustion. The dog looked more heartbroken than threatening, but the constant tension was beginning to wear Brandon down emotionally. Friends started noticing too. During a small dinner gathering at the apartment, Rocky suddenly grabbed Chloe's coat sleeve as she headed toward Brandon's office. Everyone froze. Chloe looked humiliated as Brandon pulled the dog away. One of Brandon's friends awkwardly muttered, "Man, that dog seriously does not trust her." Chloe locked herself in the bathroom afterward, crying softly while Brandon sat outside the door, feeling like his life was slowly unraveling. Later that night, Chloe finally said the words Brandon had secretly feared were coming. "I think Rocky needs professional behavioral training." Brandon looked over at the dog curled quietly near the balcony window. Rocky no longer played, no longer barked at delivery drivers, no longer greeted Brandon at the door. The dog spent most of his time simply watching and waiting, as if carrying a burden nobody else could see. Brandon remembered the shelter volunteer warning him years ago that abandoned dogs often developed anxiety after emotional trauma. Maybe that was all this was. Maybe Rocky really was spiraling emotionally, and Brandon had been too blinded by loyalty to admit it. The thought crushed him. Chloe gently placed a hand over Brandon's. "I am not asking you to give him away," she whispered. "I just think he needs to be somewhere else for a little while before somebody gets hurt." Brandon stared across the room at Rocky, expecting the dog to look restless or unstable again. Instead, Rocky slowly lowered his head onto his paws without taking his eyes off Brandon for a single second. Then Brandon quietly picked up his phone and searched for the highest-rated canine behavioral facility outside Denver. 2 days later, Brandon drove Rocky nearly 30 miles outside Denver to a behavioral training facility surrounded by pine trees and chain-link fencing. The entire ride there felt painfully quiet. Rocky did not pace or bark like Brandon expected. Instead, the German Shepherd sat unnaturally still in the back seat, staring out the window as highways and gas stations blurred past beneath gray winter skies. Every few minutes, Brandon glanced into the rearview mirror, hoping the dog would at least look at him. But Rocky avoided eye contact completely now. It hurt more than Brandon wanted to admit. The trainer, a middle-aged woman named Denise, greeted them warmly at the front office. She listened carefully while Brandon explained the recent behavior changes, though even he noticed how weak the explanations sounded out loud. "He only reacts around my girlfriend," Brandon admitted quietly. Denise crouched near Rocky, studying him for a moment. The dog did not growl or resist. If anything, he looked tired. Fear-based fixation usually comes from confusion or stress, Denise explained while clipping a temporary tag onto Rocky's collar. Dogs sometimes pick one trigger and obsess over it. Brandon nodded, even though something about that answer did not sit right with him. Before Denise led Rocky away, the German Shepherd finally turned toward Brandon for the first time all morning. Not with panic, not with anger, just sadness. It felt almost human. Brandon forced himself not to overthink it. Chloe had been right about one thing. Things could not continue the way they had been. On the drive home, Brandon stopped at a grocery store to clear his head before facing the empty apartment. While paying at self-checkout, he reached for his wallet and suddenly realized his debit card was missing. Frustrated, he searched every pocket twice before remembering he had used the card the night before to order takeout. He drove home, assuming he must have left it in the apartment somewhere. But when he checked his banking app, his stomach tightened instantly. There were 3 unfamiliar charges pending from that same morning. One for expensive jewelry, one for a hotel reservation, one for a gas station nearly 40 miles away near Pine Ridge Lodge. Brandon froze in the middle of the kitchen, staring at the screen while rain tapped softly against the apartment windows. Chloe was not home yet. He tried calming himself down logically. Maybe she borrowed the card accidentally. Maybe there was some explanation tying everything together. Yet something kept nagging at him. Brandon opened his desk drawer and pulled out the hidden second phone again. Still locked. Still buzzing occasionally, with silent notifications lighting up the screen. Then he noticed something he had somehow overlooked before. Wedged beneath the phone was a folded receipt. It was badly crumpled, like someone had shoved it there in a hurry. Brandon unfolded it slowly. Pine Ridge Lodge. Room 214. 2 guests. Paid in cash. The date printed at the top matched the exact weekend Chloe claimed she had visited her sister in Colorado Springs. Brandon felt his chest tighten. At that exact moment, his apartment door opened, and Chloe walked inside carrying shopping bags with a bright smile that immediately faded when she saw the receipt in Brandon's hand. "Where did you get that?" she asked too quickly. Brandon looked at her carefully now, noticing details he had ignored before. Her nervous breathing, the way her hand tightened around her purse strap, the tiny scratch marks near the zipper where Rocky had slammed into it days earlier. Brandon suddenly remembered something Denise had said while leading Rocky away. Dogs do not obsess over random people without a reason. Brandon slowly folded the receipt back up while Chloe forced another nervous smile. Then, for the first time since all this started, Brandon quietly decided he was going to find out exactly what Rocky had been trying to warn him about. That night, Brandon waited until Chloe finally fell asleep before quietly taking the second phone and leaving the apartment. Snow drifted lightly across the empty Denver streets as he sat alone inside his truck beneath the dim lights of a 24-hour grocery store parking lot. His hands trembled while he stared at the locked screen again and again, trying birthdays, anniversaries, random numbers, anything that might work. Nothing. Frustrated, Brandon leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes, replaying every strange moment from the past 3 months. Rocky blocking doors. Rocky dragging clothes to the entrance. Rocky refusing to leave Brandon's office unattended. Rocky slamming into Chloe's purse. Then suddenly Brandon remembered something that made his stomach twist. Months earlier, Chloe had laughed about how obsessed Rocky was with Brandon's old gray hoodie because it smelled comforting. Brandon quickly opened the phone again and typed in the numbers stitched onto the inside collar of that same hoodie. The screen unlocked instantly. Brandon stopped breathing. The phone was filled with hundreds of messages stretching back months. Different names, different men, conversations about expensive watches, bank accounts, apartment access, passwords, routines. Chloe was not simply cheating. She had been targeting people. Carefully, methodically. Brandon's chest tightened as he scrolled through photos of luxury apartments, copied driver licenses, screenshots of banking apps, and conversations about jewelry, safes, and cash. But one message thread froze him completely. The contact was saved only as M. The messages were recent. Very recent. The dog keeps getting in the way. You said he would be easy to handle. I cannot search the office with him around. Brandon felt physically sick. Then he found the message that changed everything. Tomorrow night, after he signs the investment papers, we leave before he notices the transfers. Attached beneath it was a photo taken secretly inside Brandon's office, showing documents spread across his desk beside his laptop. Brandon suddenly understood why Rocky had guarded that room constantly. The dog had not been territorial. He had been trying to stop Chloe from accessing the office. Brandon kept scrolling with growing horror until he reached voice messages Chloe had exchanged with the man from the parking lot. One of them crackled through the truck's speakers softly. The dog almost exposed the second phone tonight. Chloe whispered nervously. I swear that animal knows every time I touch something. The man laughed quietly. Then get rid of it already. Brandon's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the phone. Every strange behavior suddenly snapped into place with terrifying clarity. Rocky dragging Brandon's hoodie to the front door had not been random. Brandon always kept spare keys inside the hoodie pocket. The dog had been trying to lead him toward the motel, key hidden there. Rocky blocking Chloe from the office was never aggression. Rocky grabbing Brandon's wrist had been an attempt to pull him toward the hidden desk drawer where the second phone sat. Even the destroyed purse suddenly made sense. Rocky had smelled the second phone and motel receipt hidden inside it. The dog had been trying desperately to expose Chloe the only way he knew how. Brandon sat frozen in the truck while snow slowly collected against the windshield. Then another realization hit him even harder. The untouched medication. The locked bathroom. Rocky hiding near exits. The trembling. Chloe had not just feared the dog. She had been quietly trying to isolate him whenever Brandon was not around because Rocky kept interfering with her plans. Brandon stared down at the unlocked phone in complete silence while memories replayed differently now inside his head. Every moment he thought Rocky was unstable. Every time he scolded him. Every time the dog looked heartbroken instead of angry. Brandon suddenly remembered Rocky lowering his head onto his paws while Brandon searched for training facilities online. The dog had known exactly what was happening. And for the first time in 6 years, Brandon realized the one living thing that had never lied to him had been the dog he almost abandoned. Brandon did not drive home right away. He stayed parked beneath the falling snow for nearly an hour, staring blankly through the windshield, while the unlocked phone rested in his lap, like proof that his entire life had been quietly unraveling in front of him. But the messages were not what hurt most anymore. It was Rocky. Every memory now replayed differently inside Brandon's mind, and each one landed harder than the last. Rocky sitting outside the office door night after night was not obsession. The dog had been standing guard. Rocky knocking over the purse was not bad behavior. He had been trying to expose the hidden phone. Even the nights Rocky paced endlessly through the apartment suddenly made sense. The dog had been stressed because nobody believed him. Brandon gripped the steering wheel tightly as guilt settled over him like a physical weight pressing against his chest. He remembered yelling at Rocky for barking near the balcony. Remembered pulling his collar roughly when the dog tried dragging him toward the office. Worst of all, Brandon remembered Rocky's expression when Denise led him away at the training facility earlier that day. The dog had not looked confused. He had looked betrayed. Brandon swallowed hard and covered his eyes with one hand as emotion finally broke through him all at once. For 6 years Rocky had been beside him through every lonely night, every heartbreak, every failure, and when the dog tried harder than ever to protect him, Brandon had almost abandoned him for it. Back at the apartment, Chloe was gone by the time Brandon returned close to midnight. Half the closet was empty. The second phone charger had disappeared. So had Brandon's backup laptop and several financial documents from his office. Yet Brandon barely looked around the apartment. His eyes immediately drifted toward Rocky's empty dog bed near the balcony window. The untouched tennis ball still sat beside it exactly where Rocky left it weeks earlier. Brandon slowly walked through the silent apartment, noticing details that suddenly shattered him emotionally. Scratch marks near the office door where Rocky tried blocking Chloe from entering. The bent floor lamp the dog knocked over trying to stop her. Tiny claw marks near the bathroom door from when Chloe locked him inside. Brandon crouched beside the water bowl and touched it with trembling fingers. Completely full. Rocky really had stopped drinking when Chloe isolated him. Brandon's throat tightened painfully. Then he noticed something else sitting near the couch. Rocky's old leash. Brandon picked it up slowly and memories flooded back instantly. Early morning hikes in the Rockies. Rocky jumping into freezing lakes without hesitation. The dog sleeping beside Brandon's hospital bed after Brandon's father passed away. Every major moment of Brandon's adult life somehow included that German shepherd beside him. And Brandon almost sent him away because the dog loved him enough to keep fighting. Brandon suddenly stood up and grabbed his keys without hesitation. The drive back to the training facility felt endless. Snow covered the dark highway while Brandon replayed Denise's words over and over again. Dogs do not fake discomfort. By the time he reached the facility after midnight, most of the lights were off except for a small office lamp glowing near the entrance. Denise opened the door, looking surprised. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. Brandon could barely answer. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. Denise studied his face for a moment before nodding quietly like she already understood more than he said. She led Brandon toward the kennel area where soft barking echoed faintly through the building. But Rocky made no sound at all. The German shepherd lay curled in the corner of the kennel facing the wall, completely still beneath the dim yellow light. Brandon slowly stepped closer, gripping the leash tightly in his hand. "Rocky," he whispered. The dog lifted his head slightly at the sound of Brandon's voice, but instead of running forward like he always used to, Rocky simply stared at him silently from the far side of the kennel, as if he no longer knew whether he could trust him anymore. Brandon stood outside the kennel for several long seconds, unable to move, while Rocky watched him cautiously from the corner. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, and somewhere farther down the hallway, another dog barked once before everything fell quiet again. Denise quietly unlocked the kennel gate and stepped back without saying a word. Brandon entered slowly, lowering himself onto the cold concrete floor instead of reaching for Rocky immediately. For the first time since adopting him 6 years earlier, Brandon realized he did not know how to fix what he had broken. Rocky remained where he was, body tense, ears slightly lowered, studying Brandon carefully as if waiting for disappointment again. Brandon swallowed hard and set the leash down beside him instead of clipping it onto the collar. "I should have listened to you," he whispered softly. Rocky did not move. Brandon reached into his jacket pocket and slowly pulled out the old blue tennis ball Rocky used to carry everywhere as a puppy. He had found it earlier that night beneath the couch while searching through the apartment. The faded ball still had tiny bite marks along one side from years earlier during long hikes near Bear Creek Lake. Brandon gently rolled it across the kennel floor toward Rocky. The ball stopped inches from the dog's paws. Rocky looked down at it, but did not touch it. Brandon felt his chest tighten again. "You were trying to protect me the whole time," he said quietly, "and I kept punishing you for it." The German shepherd slowly lowered his eyes at the sound of Brandon's voice. Denise remained near the doorway, silently watching the interaction unfold. "Dogs understand trust better than people do sometimes," she finally said softly. "But when that trust gets damaged, they wait for actions, not words." Brandon nodded slowly. Then, instead of trying to pull Rocky closer, Brandon did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket again and placed Chloe's second phone directly on the kennel floor beside the tennis ball. Rocky reacted instantly. The dog stood up for the first time all night and approached cautiously, sniffing the phone before nudging it away from Brandon with his nose. Then he pushed the phone farther across the floor until it rested against the wall, as far from Brandon as possible. Denise let out a quiet breath. Brandon stared at Rocky in disbelief as emotion surged through him again. Even now, after everything, the dog was still trying to protect him. Brandon slowly extended his hand but stopped halfway, allowing Rocky to decide what happened next. For several tense seconds, the German shepherd simply stood there breathing softly. Then Rocky walked forward on his own and rested his head gently against Brandon's shoulder. Brandon closed his eyes immediately as relief washed through him so powerfully he could barely breathe. The dog's fur smelled faintly like pine wood and shampoo from the training facility, familiar and comforting in a way Brandon suddenly realized he almost lost forever. Denise quietly wiped her eyes near the doorway before slipping out to give them privacy. Brandon sat there on the kennel floor for nearly 20 minutes beside Rocky, saying almost nothing at all. He no longer cared about the stolen money or Chloe disappearing. None of it mattered as much anymore. What mattered was the exhausted German shepherd beside him who had carried fear, confusion, and stress for weeks while desperately trying to save someone he loved. Eventually, Brandon stood up slowly and looked down at Rocky. "We are not going back to that apartment tonight," he said gently. Rocky's ears lifted slightly for the first time in days. Instead of clipping on the leash immediately, Brandon opened the kennel gate fully and stepped back. Rocky hesitated only a moment before walking out beside him voluntarily. As they reached the facility exit together, snowflakes drifted softly beneath the parking lot lights outside. Rocky paused near the doorway, looked up at Brandon once, and for the first time in weeks his tail gave a small, cautious wag. 3 months later, Brandon rarely thought about the apartment in downtown Denver anymore. He moved into a smaller rental house near Evergreen surrounded by tall pine trees and quiet walking trails where Rocky could run freely again without tension filling every room. The house was older and far less modern than the apartment Chloe once insisted they needed, but for the first time in months it actually felt peaceful. No hidden phones. No whispered conversations behind closed doors. No constant uneasiness hanging in the air. Just silence, mountain wind, and the steady sound of Rocky's paws moving across wooden floors again. The changes in Rocky happened slowly at first. During the first week in the new house, the German shepherd still followed Brandon from room to room almost constantly, as though afraid to lose sight of him. If Brandon walked outside to check the mailbox, Rocky waited at the front window watching until he returned. At night, the dog slept beside the bedroom door instead of on his old bed. Brandon never tried forcing things back to normal. He understood now that trust was not rebuilt through commands. It came through consistency, through safety, through being present. Every morning before work, Brandon started taking Rocky hiking along a narrow trail overlooking frozen lakes outside town. At first, Rocky stayed unusually alert during the walks, stopping often to scan the trees around them. But week by week, the tension slowly faded from his body. The old parts of him began returning little by little. One morning, Brandon threw the faded blue tennis ball across a snowy clearing, and for the first time in months, Rocky sprinted after it with sudden joyful energy, kicking powder into the air before racing back proudly with the ball in his mouth. Brandon laughed so hard he nearly lost his balance on the icy trail. A couple hiking nearby smiled, watching the dog circle happily around him. It was such a small moment, but Brandon suddenly realized Rocky was finally starting to feel safe again too. A few weeks later, Denise from the training facility invited Brandon and Rocky back for a behavioral assessment follow-up. The moment they entered the building, Denise smiled in surprise. "That is not the same dog I met," she said softly while Rocky calmly rested beside Brandon's chair. The fear was gone from his eyes now. Denise asked what changed, and Brandon looked down at Rocky quietly before answering. "I finally started listening to him." Denise nodded like that was the entire story, because in many ways it was. Brandon never learned exactly how long Chloe had been planning everything before entering his life. Authorities eventually connected her and the man from the motel to multiple fraud investigations across Colorado and neighboring states. Brandon cooperated when asked, turned over the evidence, and then chose to leave the rest behind him. What stayed with him instead was something much simpler and much harder to forget. Every warning Rocky gave came from love. Every strange behavior came from fear of losing the person he was trying to protect. One cold evening near the beginning of spring, Brandon sat on the back porch wrapped in an old blanket while sunset painted the mountains orange and gold in the distance. Rocky lay beside him, quietly chewing on the same worn tennis ball from years earlier. Brandon reached down absent-mindedly and scratched behind the dog's ears. Rocky leaned against his leg with complete trust this time, calm and steady beneath the fading light. Brandon looked out across the trees for a long moment before speaking softly. Into the silence. "You tried to save me long before I knew I needed saving." Rocky lifted his head slightly at the sound of Brandon's voice, then rested it gently across Brandon's foot as the wind moved softly through the pines around them. Sometimes the purest hearts speak the loudest without ever saying a word.